It's going to be a long talk about my thoughts and my experiences in Japan. 3 months in Japan, 1 month in Okinawa, and 2 months in and around Kyoto, Osaka, Kansai, this area. And it'll be a deep dive, a big reflection on what was it like 3 months living in Japan? What were some of the ideas, reflections, takeaways, and lessons learned from 3 months in Japan? And what's my review? What are my thoughts on it? I really wanted to spend as much time as possible in Japan. I think I could have spent another 6 months in Japan easy. After doing a pretty exhaustive list and deep dive into what countries and what places do I want to experience and learn from the most, Japan basically came out as number one on the list. There's a variety of factors for that. Number one, Japan and Italy, I guess also Singapore. Japan is the longest, generally one of the healthiest, longest living countries by quite a few different metrics and indices that try and look at longevity, health outcomes, etc. Okinawa, the region in Okinawa, there's a blue zone in Japan. Although again, after experiencing Japan and the diversity in Japan and Okinawa being a part of Japan, that definitely seems a bit controversial. Okinawa, the Ryukyu Kingdom used to be its own thing, but anyways, needless to say, it seems that that sort of healthy living and longevity, that extends well beyond just Okinawa. It seems to be in that region of the world, there seems to be a lot of common shared ideas. The health concept, the blue zone, these were things that were very intriguing and curious and attractive for me about Japan. But I think like a lot of people, it was also just so this seemingly little, that's probably not the right thing to say, but this little island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Okay, it's not in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but you get my point that it would be so, I always got these advanced futuristic vibes from Japan, South Korea, and so just to discover that part as well. But I think it went beyond that for me because over the years, I started to recognize that I had a lot of curiosity and interest in Japan as a whole. I started to connect the dots with some cartoons and shows, and then recognizing that these things are actually called animes in Japan, and that a lot of some pop culture things, movies, and a lot of these things, like let's say like Nintendo, Pokemon. When I was a kid, I grew up watching a couple animes, like Naruto was one of my favorite ones, Dragon Ball Z. Japan had a lot of culture. I mean, they call it this soft power, this culture that it spread throughout the world, pop culture. It's a relatively small island, quite isolated. How was this possible? And then also connecting, when I was younger, I enjoyed and was really curious about stuff with the Jedi from Star Wars that are kind of modeled a bit after like warrior monks or samurai, these sort of things that really were, when I was younger, and at different ages, even as I grew up, were really, really interesting and really curious for me. And I started to connect the dots and see that these things all went back to Japan in a lot of ways. I even did, when I was younger, my parents had my brother and I involved in karate, and we call it karate, but I think it's karate. Point is, this was also, I believe that's actually from Okinawa, but this is also, you could sort of also lump it in and say this is a Japanese thing. And so I started to really recognize just how fascinating this was. And then, of course, looking at, World War II and the history and the culture of the world, what was going on in the middle of the 20th century. these stories with the atomic bombs and Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We would all also probably call it Hiroshima. I don't actually know which one is the right pronunciation, so excuse me. I didn't go there when I was there. Didn't have enough time, but I hope and plan to go back. So just my curiosity, my interest, and my motivation built over time with Japan, to the point where it was more and more clear for me when I was making my travel plans and travel itinerary, especially related to the Blue Zones, that Japan was just sort of bubbling up to the top. It was bubbling up right to the top of the surface, and I knew this was a place that was really high priority for me to go and to visit. And these things you hear about, this futuristic society, the bullet trains. I think a year or two ago, I saw that movie with Brad Pitt about bullet trains, and again, a little bit of this like samurai katanas, these samurai swords, and the public transportation, the Shinkansen, the bullet trains, Mount Fuji, this majestic volcano in the background. This soft culture, this pop culture from Japan is very strong in not only the States, but I'd say in a lot of other countries. Especially, I came to learn a lot of French people. There were so many French people in Kyoto and in Japan, and that the Japanese and the French sort of have this like mutual sort of love affair going on, that they both see themselves as this kind of high culture and high class of, one is maybe a bit of the high culture, high class of Asia. One is the high culture, the high class of Europe. This sort of mutual affection and respect. And there's also a lot of fascination and curiosity from Japan and the Japanese in the United States as well. That built up for me over time, and connecting that with the Blue Zones was just sort of a perfect sort of win-win. It made so much sense, and that was clear. That was going to be the number one place for me to go to. And after being there for 3 months, I'm so happy about the decision. I was had a little bit of like cold feet at the beginning in Okinawa, because of course, traveling like I travel as a slow mad, as a sort of pseudo digital nomad, slow nomadic adventurer, traveler, sort of historical, cultural, societal self-scientist. I just really wanted to learn as much as I could, and that's tough if you don't take the time to spend in one place. You need to have a decent living situation, a decent accommodation. It's not necessarily easy to line all that stuff up, especially when you're not a resident, when you're not a citizen, when you don't have some of the proper authorizations and allowances to stay. And so I was allowed to be there for 90 days, for 3 months. And at first I was a little bit skeptical how that would go, but it was a very good decision. It was first month basically in Okinawa, in the Blue Zone region in northern Okinawa. And then the second leg of the journey, the following 2 months after Okinawa, that was in Kyoto. I was based in and around Kyoto University, by the Kamogawa, this river delta area, a little bit north of Kawaramachi in the downtown and Gion district of Kyoto. And luckily for me, Kyoto is such a big university city that I was able to find some easier, longer living accommodations. So I was able to, live longer term in Kyoto in a shared apartment, these co-living spaces that are more and more popular, co-housing, co-living, shared flats, shared apartments. I was able to live in Kyoto with a lot of other students. Luckily for me, there's so many universities and so many young people, students that are based and centered in and around Kyoto. It being this incredibly old, ancient capital city probably at this point it's at least 1,500 years old, if not longer, if not older. Luckily for me, I was able to fairly easily, fairly quickly find a living accommodation in Kyoto, even during Golden Week, which is this typical period for them of a lot of vacation. I think it's basically one of the most popular vacation weeks of the whole year. So it can be very hard to find accommodation, and especially to have your own bed, your own private room, and to not be in these dorms and in these hostels, which for me as a long-term traveler, that's just so exhausting after a while. It's good to be able to have your own four walls so that you can get your rest, you can get your sleep. The first month in Okinawa was really nice. I met up with a really good friend, Hannah, who has been with me along the journey at different points, looking into the blue zones. She and I first went to Sardinia in Italy about 5 or 6 years ago. And so Hannah and I had been talking about getting back together to explore another blue zone. And luckily, especially for Hannah, it's relatively close to Australia. And so we met up there. We made some plans, and Hannah was super helpful in planning. I'm not the biggest planner. I like to go a little bit more spontaneous and go with the flow, but that has its own pros and cons, of course. And so Hannah and I settled in Okinawa for around about that first month. And unfortunately, I was sick for a good 7 days, which definitely killed some of the time that we had there. Unfortunately, really got a sense of this a bit more peaceful, calm culture and people and weather and climate in Okinawa, and especially this sort of down to earth, laid back, and it's wild for me and incredible for me because seeing and learning about the things that the Okinawans had been through in the past with Japan, a lot of controversy and conflict there, and then World War II. The fact that they've been able to move on from a lot of that and to live and let live. And so many people are not necessarily lost living in the past, but are living in the here and the now and living a fairly, calm, peaceful. It is controversial because Okinawa, as far as a region in Japan, is one of the most impoverished, just some of the societal issues that we all know about, whether that's perhaps a little bit of homelessness or maybe a little bit more pollution and litter, or a bit more challenges with, from one of the stories I heard, there's a lot of issues with sort of unplanned pregnancies and basically, sort of broken families and single mothers in Okinawa, alcoholism, and just, too much alcohol, too much drinking in Okinawa. So, I think it depends how you look at Okinawa. There's obviously multiple areas of Okinawa. Okinawa is fairly long from top to bottom, not very wide, but quite long. And Okinawa itself has a chain of islands. It is, again, a magical, beautiful, beautiful place with really magical nature, wonderful, wonderful people, and its own sort of rich and deep history and culture. And the southern part of Okinawa, where the airport is, Naha, the main city of Okinawa, of course, with these bigger cities, this is usually where you find some of these more social, societal challenges and the dirty, ill side of society with just pollution, litter, perhaps a little bit more issues with alcohol, drugs. But again, on the surface level, just really, for me as a newcomer, just I didn't see a lot of this stuff. I heard about it, but I didn't necessarily see a lot of it. I saw a little bit more of this, the Hawaii of Japan, as they call it, and also a little bit more of the the Blue Zone region in the north, where it's less developed, less modernized, less industrialized. And so it was just lovely there, and minus the difficulties finding a more comfortable, longer term living accommodation. I mean, there are some buses, there is some bit of public transportation and infrastructure, but generally having a car there is very important. And so, minus those things, it was really like this little paradise, especially in the north. You know, the food, the lifestyle, the focus on community and family, and also just this general sense of happiness and joy and positivity. And the music, the culture, this sort of three-stringed, sort of like a banjo, the bottom section being sort of let out, the outer layer is with a snake skin. This is called the sanshin. Sanshin. You know, this was just really, you could get the feeling of how the people could live long and healthy lives here. And this just, yeah, beautiful, beautiful tropical, subtropical island. And, you know, also that we were there in, I guess, pretty much April. Weather was lovely. You know, it was just, you know, there was a lot of rain when we were there. It seemed as though they said that the rainy season was early, but they had been basically praying for this because it had been very dry up until that point. And they were, you know, the people there were starting to get worried about water. So, you know, things really were quite lovely as I was there. But, you know, biggest thing for me was just battling a bit with my health and the lessons again around needing to make sure that I can control my sleeping space and I can get good rest and get good a little bit of R&R. And Okinawa was really a pleasure. And I think again the lesson there was around this, you know, getting away from the big city and this slower pace of life, this older traditional cultures, using food and good quality local homegrown food as a medicine, and being connected to this beautiful natural world with beautiful climate, beautiful temperatures. It seemed like Okinawa generally is in a pretty nice sort of Goldilocks zone, sort of sweet spot of it's not too hot, it's not too cold. So it's just a very comfortable climate there. And I imagine outside of kind of the big cities where the heat gathers anyways, most people probably didn't even need an air conditioner. So it's just it seemed like a very natural and pure place, even though they had suffered and seen a lot of tragedies in their past. You know, so let's move on to Kyoto. Let's move up to mainland Japan and talk a little bit more about mainland Japan. So the joke about Japan that really stuck with me in a lot of ways is this: back in the 1980s and the 1990s, Japan was already living in the 2000s. And now today, in almost 2025, Japan is basically still living in the 2000s. So it's a funny thing, and I see some similarities with being in Singapore now and connecting with Singapore, but still reflecting on my time in Japan, that there's just this incredible, in Singapore as well, and in Japan after World War II, there's just this economic, societal miracle that took place of just rapid, futuristic development of the people, the culture, the infrastructure, modern medicine still mixed with some more perhaps Eastern medicine philosophies and styles, methods. But it was so cool because even though we're in 2025 now, we're not in 2005, you know, I could still feel and see and taste just how modern and futuristic and sort of has a bit of that sci-fi, little bit of cyberpunk feeling to it, with some of the buildings, the lights, these neon lights, these nightlife and cityscapes and city lights. It's just really it's really an incredible place. You got that feeling. Not as much in Kyoto, and Kyoto was where I was mostly based, and I had to make a decision between, do I want to be more in Tokyo and Edo and that region, or do I want to be in this more older traditional, Kyoto was the original capital for, I think, like 1,000 years, and it's really just been the last 200, 300 something years that Tokyo, and you see the similarities in the name, Tokyo and Kyoto. It's sort of like the inverse, right? It's like Kyoto, they take the to and they move it to the front. Now it's Tokyo, right? So essentially it's a very similar word meaning capital, but Tokyo, this to means eastern capital. So it's kind of funny how it developed, but of course Tokyo is much more modern, more futuristic. I didn't even end up going there, but of course I talked with a lot of people who have been there. I decided to focus more on the historical, cultural, this deeper, very traditional historical capital in this region. And I knew that next to Kyoto is Osaka, which is I think it's the second biggest metropolitan area in Japan. And it also has some very modern, futuristic Tokyo vibes to it. So I figured that's kind of good enough, and I can get between the two in 45 minutes, basically, on the trains. So future trips plan to go to Tokyo, but I had to make a decision, and I decided from what I heard about Kyoto, it's just so incredible, this cultural capital of Japan, this historical capital of Japan. And then the nature there, it's in this sort of mountain valley surrounded by these hills, some, and back in Austria or on the west coast of the US or Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, we wouldn't really be calling these mountains. They're not that tall. But I mean, a couple of them get up to almost 800, 900 meters, getting closer to 2,500 feet. And so it's just this little protected and safe, supposedly fairly immune to natural disasters, this protected historical capital with, cleaner air. You just get a bit more connected to this original historic Japan vibe. And that was what I was really aiming for, as well as, not losing 100% of all the nature that I had really enjoyed in Okinawa, just going to this massive big city with just a few sort of man-made engineered parks that I imagine Tokyo has more of them from what I heard from people, whereas Kyoto has still some wild nature and some real pure nature to it. I've heard lots of different things about different areas, and I have heard some things that say, Kyoto, where I was living, it's its own little bubble, and that's not really what the rest of Japan is like. And obviously from Kyoto, I also made quite a few trips to Nara, Osaka. I was in Okinawa. I also went over to Lake Biwako, to some of the smaller villages next to this biggest lake. It's the biggest lake in Japan, and it's in the region called Shiga. So in Shiga, where I also spent some time there, is supposed to be one of the healthiest, longest living prefectures, or AKA little regions, little states inside of Japan. But Kyoto is also in I think top 5 as far as longest living. So I still think that's fairly emblematic. That was a big part of my decision. And it was such a good decision. I was really worried and really anxious that I wasn't going to find a place to stay. But thanks to, I met this one guy who had been in Taiwan. He told me about some of these co-living websites in Japan. I was able to use these, and even during Golden Week, I was luckily, thanks to this one Kyoto apartment, I was able to find a co-living space at a very, very reasonable price, I feel, for, 2024. I think it was like, something like 350, $400 a month, that I could rent basically on a monthly basis. And that gave me, a safe, quiet, secure place, but also a little bit more social community atmosphere to connect with, local people, local students, people studying there, a lot of masters and PhD students specifically, to really get to dig in deep and connect with Kyoto and with this heart of old traditional Japan. And that was perfect. It took a week or two to start making some friends, and I used this meetup app and some Facebook groups, but mostly this meetup app to go to meetups, to go to social events, social activities, to meet as many people as possible. I was going to like 3 or 4 a week, usually in the evenings, but there was so many more I could have gone to. I only scratched the surface. But after 2 or 3 weeks, I was able to really make some deeper connections, make some friends. And that was, of course, a game changer. Now, as much as I think in some ways I'm a bit more of an introvert, I'm really nowadays some sort of ambivert, and I need some time to myself, no doubt, but I also need this social connection, this culture. And this is one of the reasons why I still often gravitate when I'm traveling to cities, and because there's a lot of life, that's where a lot of the people are living. It's not maybe necessarily the cleanest, purest life in Japan, let's say, but it is where a lot of the people are. And there's a lot of culture, there's a lot of music, there's a lot of art, there's a lot of young people, and I get a lot of exchange and energy from that. And especially in Japan, if you want to speak English and exchange with people, the younger people are the ones with the best English, and they're the best ones to kind of engage with. And so that was really critical as well. I was able to find this place and really engage with a lot of, they weren't all Japanese. Actually, this is something that people talk about a lot, is that they even talk about it in some Japanese movies and shows, is this sort of outside exterior layer and wall that a lot of people in Japan put up. It's a bit harder to really connect on a deeper level and to get through this wall. I mean, it's not the first time I've heard something like this. This is also something that I think a lot of the Northern Europeans, Nordic, Scandinavians, also the Germans, this is something that I've heard numerous times and I've experienced, that it's not always the quickest, easiest, warmest connection that you're able to just easily make a deep friendship. It takes time to crack the nut, to sort of crack that shell and get in there. That's something that's a historical, cultural thing, and perhaps sometimes a bit of a skepticism of outsiders. I mean, you can kind of empathize and understand with that. Being an island nation, it's very rare that other people from around the world historically would have really gotten there. Obviously, we don't live in this historical past. There's still seemingly this skepticism, a little bit of skepticism, or just keeping a little bit of safe space and distance. And that seems to be widespread in the culture, whether you protect your hygiene with wrapping everything in plastic, keep it safe, keep it clean, keep it hygienic, or whether you don't really hug people. There's not a lot of hugging in Japan. Maybe if you get really deeper, older friendships, then there's some hugging, but it's not so much of a very deeper emotional, deep connection there. And that was also hard for me to form, especially given my lack of Japanese language skills. a mutual thing, often a lack of English skills on their end, but also just the fact that, I often don't do a lot of touristy things and just live day-to-day life and just see what it's like living there. Knowing that I'm going to be leaving also probably didn't help a lot of people want to build a deeper connection with me, because they know that, well, I mean, at least he's here for more than a week or two. He's here for 2 or 3 months, but then he's going to be gone. That's something that you don't experience quite as much in, let's say, Latin America, South America, I'd say even North America, in the Mediterranean, in Southern Europe, in Southern Asia, Southeast Asia. There's more of this warmth. And I would say that the Japanese, my experience was that they were very, very kind and very friendly. People would say there's a difference between friendliness and just being respectful. But I still got a little bit more of this warmth, actually, even more than I expected in some ways. Like I've heard in the past, you always have to disconnect the people and the politics. I don't know too much about modern Japanese politics, but historically, some of Japanese history, there was a lot of conflict and a lot of violence and a lot of different clans vying for power, for dominance, for influence. And then, as we know from the middle of the 20th century and different times, there's also a lot of just expansion and invasion going on, sort of brought out by the Japanese. And that's again where you have to perhaps separate the Japanese from the imperial political side of Japan, or the government and politicians and the military and those sorts of things, right? Because my experience with just your average day-to-day Japanese is that they were just very kind, very respectful, and obviously it's a different day and age, it's a different world, so you can't really, it's not apples to apples. But it is just, yeah, it is a paradoxical thing when you study history, you study what happened in the 20th century, or even for literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of Japanese history. There was a lot of violence and aggression and conflict. And I don't get that sense of anything like that nowadays. It seems that perhaps similar to Singapore, and again, it's a controversial, it's a conflicting, paradoxical sort of thing. From what I understand about Japanese politics, it's mostly been basically just one, maybe a second one that's come in from time to time, but one political party that's really held most of the power and the influence in Japan for most of the time since World War II. And there's still technically, I believe it's the only country that still has an emperor, and there's a royal family with a, royal sacred bloodline. So it's very confusing, because for us in the West, with our democracies and with our, freedom and liberty, it's a confusing thing, because it does seem that they have tried in Japan, whoever they are, the powers that be, to make the average, normal quality of life there quite good. And I got to personally experience that on a day-to-day basis. And from the stories I heard of how they've held some traditions and some quality and some standards to allow people to have a generally pretty good average quality of life. And there's a lot of people on this little little island. It's, I think probably at its peak 130 million people or so, and now for the last 5 or 6 years the population has been declining, and very low birth rates, one of the top 3, I think, lowest birth rates in the world. But for the lack of space that they have, because even though they do have space. A lot of it are hills and mountains, some lakes. There's not necessarily a ton of like livable, arable, usable space on, mainland Japan. And this is something that they seem to have taken this challenge, similar to what Singapore has been doing here. They seem to have taken this challenge in Japan with their limited space, their limited resources, to try to be as efficient, as innovative as possible, and knowing that their people are their main resource, that their people, their culture, food, their music, their pop culture, movies and TV shows and animes, that this is incredibly powerful for them. And they seem to have done an incredible thing. I think you can find a lot of videos on YouTube, and I watched tons of videos just trying to learn as much as I could, as well as all the conversations I was having, to try and understand Japan. And you'd hear a lot of people saying that Japan's economy and the currency, the Japanese yen, that it's sort of going down and it's decreasing. But from a individual ground level, average person, day-to-day life, it seemed like life was really generally pretty good there. Probably you didn't have as many of these massive McMansions like you'll see in the West, especially in like North America, but average quality of life seemed to be quite good. But from a macroeconomic financial perspective, yeah, it maybe seemed like they're not the booming biggest economy in the world. They used to be a bigger one, and they've been kind of losing some of that share to China and South Korea, and a lot of electronics and this sort of stuff, also to Taiwan. Those macroeconomic metrics that are often, and KPIs, these key performance indicators that are often pointed towards as great and rich and wealthy and strong, productive nations, I don't know if that stuff always translates down to a good life, a good, happy, healthy, quality life for your average person. And that's what was the most impressive for me in Japan. If they've been living like this, with this quality, from their trains and their transportation to their medicine and their healthcare, to a lot of their just incredible food, this food that's beloved in the world and the region, to their history and their art, if they've been at this high of a level for the last 25, 30 years, and now they're not, other countries, other regions are catching up to them. Now, it doesn't surprise me, because I feel like in some ways, they've certainly reached the pinnacle and maxed out in some of these areas. From what I understand, let's say about the trains. The trains generally, the Shinkansen, the bullet trains, they generally can't necessarily go any faster, because that would disturb the public, that would disturb the peace, because it would be like sonic booms. It would be massive, loud, very disturbing sounds to the population. And for the distances that they have to go, they don't necessarily need to go any faster. The distances from the main regions, from Tokyo to Osaka, Kansai, Nagoya, down to Kyushu and Fukuoka and Nagasaki, Hiroshima, these aren't huge distances. And the bullet trains, the Shinkansen, and then planes, which are even cheaper generally from what I've heard than the bullet trains, the Shinkansen. Why, you save like 15, 20 minutes, but you're disturbing the environment and the peace and the public. Why do this? And so there's a lot of things like this where they've really tried to focus not so much always on the productivity and the some of these typical, let's say, a bit more capitalistic measures, in economic measures, but actually on the quality of life and the health and the peace and the quality of the people. And so it is very impressive. And it was just wonderful to see this and to experience it. And for me, the biggest thing is once I started to build some friends and community and started having really deep conversations about topics like this, it was smooth sailing from that point on. Haven't been sick since Okinawa, and it's been 3.5 months. I think the food quality, the prices, and everything in Japan were for me, I felt very affordable, especially compared to what I've seen in other places like in Singapore now, in Austria and Germany and Switzerland and Italy and California and the US. Forget about it. It's way too expensive there. What the people were getting just seemed very good. But the trade-off again is, the trade-off that, a lot of people seem there that they have to make. From what I had heard from countless people and also countless videos, the work-life balance and the work culture there is really tough. But again, it's a philosophy and a mindset sort of thing, because from what I understood, it's seen as more of an honor and a duty, this work, and a valuable service and a valuable honor, and it's your special honor and gift and your duty, your natural responsibility to follow through on these things. It's not necessarily seen these long working hours and perhaps lack of vacation time and work-life balance. It's seen as a honorable, dutiful thing to fulfill and to do, and not necessarily, like you're being really exploited and taken advantage of, and you're not getting anything in return. I think it's that, again, pretty good average quality of life there, where people do feel like they're getting something in return. The history, the religious philosophies, or just life philosophies there, they allow people to make sense and come to terms to pretty intense careers and work-life balances. But of course, there is, I believe the word is karoshi, and there is a challenge with this, that a lot of people are dying especially men are dying at quite a young age. I think karoshi is the right word, and it means basically death by work, death by overwork. That through this overwork, that you literally kind of work yourself to exhaustion and work yourself to death. And it is a fairly, unfortunately, common thing. So these trade-offs you hear about them and they're somewhat visible or apparent, but, and I guess also similar to South Korea, there's a high level of depression and suicide rates, some of the highest in the world. I don't mean to gloss over those things and brush them aside and, brush them under the mattress, and you just never see them again. And, it's not my mission and not my goal with my travel and with Pursuit of Better to just focus on just the negative and bad things. It's my goal to still look for the brilliant, the magical, the wonderful, the inspiring, the whimsical, lovely things to see from the world. And, I think the big lessons for me were this sort of cleanliness and hygiene and respect for health. The mask wearing culture that still is quite widespread, although not always. To be honest, I was surprised sometimes when I was on buses or other things and didn't see a lot of people with masks. And they seemed like they were local Japanese people. But just this cleanliness, this efficiency, this, things generally work. The public transportation generally works. A lot of your basic needs are there and are taken care of. And people are trying to, again, since they all live together in this tight space on this island, there's this respect for your neighbors and respect for public spaces. And perhaps a controversial topic, but, it's 98% of the ethnic population in Japan, of this almost 130 million people, they are ethnic Japanese people. That's what they claim. So it's a very homogenous society, but that means there's generally much more of a sense of empathy, sympathy, and tolerance and understanding for your neighbors because they are you. They are basically generally quite the same as you. So, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's also something that I saw a lot in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries, and I'd say Denmark was a pretty good example of this, perhaps Finland as well. But, there's generally a sense of I want to help out my neighbors and I'm willing to give more taxes towards infrastructure, education, medicine, and healthcare because I trust them, and they might as well be my cousins and my aunts and uncles, and especially here in Southeast Asia again, and it's sort of similar in Latin America. People calling even strangers their aunties and their uncles. There's more of this just willingness to give for the collective, for the greater good of the public and the collective, and that's something that we really miss a lot, unfortunately, in the West. There's not as much of this willingness to give and give back for your neighbors. And what's the cause of that and why is that? Hard to say. You can make your own conclusions, but it was just very cool to see how Japan was able to and is able to create this social cohesion and create this safety, this security. Again, one of the safest, cleanest, securest. I felt no sense of danger or risk there. Mostly I felt it maybe from like tsunamis, typhoon, volcanoes, earthquakes. It's a very disaster-prone country. Even though they don't take up much land on the global sphere in the world, they don't take up much space, but they account for some of the highest percentage. I think it's like 15-20% or something of all the natural disasters that occur. They're in a very tricky spot as far as ocean storms, plate tectonics, earthquakes, and this sort of stuff. They're in a tricky spot. But that also means that they go through these struggles, these crises, these disasters, and they have to support each other. And if not them, if not themselves, who's gonna rescue them? Who's gonna help them? Who's gonna save them? It has to be they themselves and their neighbors. And so that's just really inspiring that they take such good care of each other and of their spaces. There's a lot of things that are done there by the local people or by volunteers in keeping the streets, keeping things clean, and how there's not even really trash cans. There's not even really bins, trash cans, garbage cans around for you to just take your little bit of trash and litter and to just chuck it away. A lot of people put it in their bag or they carry it home with them. So it's an incredible level of honor and respect for each other, for themselves, for their natural world. And from what I understand, there's a big connection there with Shintoism, this sort of homegrown, local, natural Japanese religion, Shinto and Shintoism, in respecting more of this natural environment, that there are deities, there are spirits, there are gods that are imbued in the environment and are such a big part of the world there. So of course they want to treat these things with care and respect, and you see it typically. I think of the few days that I was in Osaka, that was one of the dirtiest places, but I still felt like, wow, this isn't so bad. This is actually still generally quite clean. And I think what makes Japan such an interesting place as a little societal cultural experiment again is this sort of island effect, right? Like many different islands around the world, there's always, because they're so isolated and they have very clear natural borders and boundaries, what does that isolation, what does that sort of separation do to the people, the culture, the language, the food, the cuisine, the arts, the music, those sorts of things. And you see that pretty strongly in Japan, because not only did they have those natural borders and that natural isolation, after this works in pretty well with that really popular show, Shogun. The historical events from the show are set sometime in the 1600s or something like that. And after this period, they felt in Japan more and more like there was this sort of influence and meddling coming from the European powers, Spain and Portugal, and now more so with England and the Dutch, the Netherlands. There was this more and more natural sort of trying to expel these foreign invaders and these foreign powers, and that they were meddling too much. So not only were those natural borders of their coastline of the ocean ever present, but also after this period of the Shogun show, which is relatively historically accurate, they basically closed off their borders. They kept a small little trade contingent going on with the Dutch down in Kyushu. I believe this was kind of this necessary, desired trade going on for some European things, but a lot of trade between China and Japan. And so how does this culture, how do these people, how do they develop with that really pure, almost pure isolationism? And of course, it's a very different day and age now, and the borders have been open for quite a long time again. And that's a whole nother story in and of itself. Japan sort of being forced and pushed to open its borders somewhat against its will, but how they took their uniquely isolated and developed cultures and technologies and their own versions of life as we know it, and how they blended that with the West that was more and more ever present in their world. And from what I know and from what I've heard in other countries in Asia in general, it's a very special thing with Japan, because a lot of other countries were invaded or conquered, sometimes often by the Japanese. But Japan was a bit special in the fact that it didn't have as much sort of influence and development. And it had literally hundreds and hundreds of years of its own isolation. And that's just a fascinating thing to see how that plays out on a society and a culture, and especially so different from what a lot of us are used to in the West. From what I've heard, and I find this, I don't know if this is proven, I've just read and studied and heard a little bit about it, but there was kind of this ever-present trade and exchange going on between China and Japan. And historically, China had been sort of, you could say, of Asia, it was like the Greeks and the Romans. It was sort of this ancient, but ever-evolving, ever-developing culture where so many important developments occurred in Asia, and it was the source of a lot of those things. But there was a lot of exchange and interchange with Japan, and because of this isolation island effect, Japan kind of took it and ran with it sometimes on their own. There were different periods where the two countries looked at each other, sometimes a bit more sort of pointing fingers at the other and calling the other sort of like a simpleton and barbaric and savage, uncivilized, undeveloped. There's this little bit of talk, and I don't know how much truth there is to this theory, that China with Hong Kong and the British, there was a lot of meddling and influence, and the trade, and then the Opium Wars, and then Hong Kong and all this sort of stuff, that this more traditional, high level, high class part of Chinese knowledge, Chinese society, Chinese culture, Chinese traditions was really kind of taken on and carried on by Japan. Yeah, I'd have to spend years more in this region to know the truth about that. I'm very curious because, of course, you do see a lot of similarities and then, of course, some stronger differences, but some more subtle differences between Japan, China, and South Korea, and also Taiwan, right? Potentially like a little bit of, I guess, the Roman Empire with the Greeks. The torch was handed on, and this high level development continued perhaps in a different place than it started or originated from. So this is just one example of how deep and how intricate and how fascinating Japan and in this region, how the culture and the history, how deep it is and how fascinating it can be if you're into that type of stuff. And I am. My mission and my quest was to look into life and culture and health in Japan and see what we could learn. And I've talked about it in some other videos, but again, there's a bit more of this tradition, this respect, this honor, this sense of duty and service that's really revered and respected, and this sense of really doing right by the people. And somehow, even these stories of when companies have had to raise their prices, they've had to sometimes they feel like they want to do like a public apology, that they are sorry, that they are so sorry that they've had to now inconvenience their customers. So it really shows, you see it with a lot of things there, the high attention to detail and the quality and the design, that they really do care about creating an incredible product for not just Japanese people in Japan, but for people of the world, and their products, their cars, their machines, their technology is everywhere. So it's a really fascinating story, and I would encourage everyone. There's endless amounts of videos out there about Japan. I would encourage you all, if you're interested in the subject, I can try to put together a list of some of my favorite videos, but they're endless, and I probably watched 30, 40 minutes a day. So I think the list is too long. But there's just so much to be learned, and there's some people might consider it a more conservative and traditional and not so open-minded place and culture, but I think there's a lot we can learn from Japan and the Japanese. But again, if you have more questions, if you have more curiosities, send them over. Thanks for being a part of this journey, and thanks for tuning in to this uncut, uncensored take on a little time and a little life in Japan.